Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So think about holding the deed to the entire island of Manhattan in your hand.
Right, just the whole thing.
Yeah, all of it. The natural deep water ports, the endless forests, the future financial capital of the globe.
Pretty valuable piece of paper.
Very. But now you willingly trade that deed away for a swampy patch of South American jungle. And you do it simply because the accountants back home tell you the short-term math makes more sense.
Which is, it's a very tough pill to swallow from a modern perspective.
It really is. If you are accustomed to the standard narrative of European colonialism, that transaction sounds entirely incomprehensible. We usually picture kings and queens dispatching royal armadas, planting flags on beaches, claiming vast continents by divine right, desperate to paint the global map in their national colors.
Yeah, the standard model is highly ideological and deeply territorial.
Right.
The Spanish, the French, the English, they operated primarily on the logic of sovereign conquest. Success was measured in the sheer square mileage of land incorporated into the empire.
And the number of souls converted to the state religion, usually.
Precisely. The crown funded the expedition and, well, the crown owned the results.
Which brings us to the topic of today's deep dive. We are continuing our History of the Americas series, taking our sources and examining a parallel universe of colonial history. We're looking at the Dutch colonization of the Americas.
Yeah, it's a completely different rule book.
Completely. When you step into the 17th century Netherlands, that traditional royal map painting model goes entirely out the window. We are looking at an endeavor driven not by monarchs, but by shareholders, boardrooms, dividends.
It's really the purest early expression of corporate expansion. The motivations, the organizational structures, the very reasons for putting a ship in the water across the Atlantic were completely alien to the other European powers of the era.
Just totally different priorities.
Yeah. The ledgers, the profit margins, and the quarterly returns dictated the borders. And a vital piece of context for you listening is the timeline. We so often associate the Dutch colonial empire with Asia.
Like the spice trade in present-day Indonesia.
Right, exactly. Closely tied to that. But Dutch efforts in the Americas actually preceded the establishment of their first Asian fort in 1600.
So, as we navigate these sources today, keep asking yourself a central question. How different would the Western Hemisphere look right now if the Dutch had prioritized permanent territorial settlement over temporary commercial profit?
It's a huge what if.
It is. So to understand the mechanism of this corporate vanguard, we have to start by looking at the explorers themselves. And we need to go back to the year 1602. That really acts as the genesis of this entire philosophy.
Yeah, so in 1602, the political entity known as the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands chartered a highly ambitious institution, the Dutch East India Company.
Universally known by its Dutch acronym, the VOC.
Right. Now, the VOC was a joint stock company. Citizens could buy shares on the Amsterdam Exchange, pooling their capital to fund incredibly expensive, high-risk maritime expeditions.
Kind of like early venture capitalism.
Very much so. And the VOC was given a very specific set of directives regarding North America. They were not told to establish utopian societies. They were tasked with exploring the continent's rivers and bays, specifically to locate a direct maritime passage through to the Indies.
Finding a shortcut, basically.
Yes, a shortcut.
Because sailing around the southern tip of Africa was painfully long, heavily guarded by the Portuguese, and, just financially draining.
Yeah, the goal was to bypass the Spanish and Portuguese monopolies entirely. And along the way, these VOC-funded explorers were charged with claiming any uncharted areas they stumbled upon for the United Provinces.
But not necessarily to settle them, right?
No, not at all. It was more to lock down the intellectual property of the route. This dual directive, find a passage while legally marking uncharted zones, kicked off a series of highly consequential voyages.
Let's look at how that actually played out on the water. By 1610, the VOC had hired Henry Hudson.
Who was actually an English explorer.
Right, an Englishman. But he was carrying a Dutch corporate contract. The VOC sent him out to find that elusive Northwest Passage. Hudson sailed a ship called the Half Moon into the upper New York Bay. He headed up the wide navigable river that we now call the Hudson River, mapping the depth and the currents.
Just looking for a way through.
Yeah. And in the process, he claimed significant portions of the present-day United States and Canada for the VOC. Fundamentally under the assumption that this waterway might slice right through the continent to the Pacific.
Which it didn't, obviously.
No, not at all.
The river narrowed, the water turned fresh, and Hudson realized he was in a dead end. but the geographic data he returned with was immensely valuable. Following Hudson, the strategy kind of refined itself. In 1614, we see the expedition of Adrian Block.
Block was commanding a ship called the Tiger, exploring the lower Hudson River. And there's a really visceral detail in the sources here. The Tiger accidentally caught fire and burned to the waterline during the winter.
Which is pretty much a worst-case scenario.
Yeah, it leaves his crew stranded in a brutal North American winter.
Right. But rather than perishing, Block and his crew spent the winter of 1613 to 1614 surviving with the help of the local indigenous population. And they actually built a completely new vessel from local timber.
That's incredible.
Yeah, they named it the Onrust, which translates to the Restless. Aboard the Onrust, Block proceeded to explore the East River. His crowning navigational achievement was successfully charting the treacherous waters of the Helligate.
The Hellgate.
Yes, the Hellgate.
Anyone who's ever looked at the nautical charts of New York knows the Hellgate is terrifying. You have the swirling tidal currents of the East River colliding with Long Island Sound. There are hidden rocks, whirlpools, unpredictable flows.
It's notoriously dangerous.
To be the first European to successfully map and navigate that route in a tiny hand-built wooden vessel is a monumental feat of seamanship.
And he secured a tangible legacy for it, too. Block Island and Block Island Sound carry his name today. But his bureaucratic contribution upon returning to Amsterdam in 1614 was far more impactful than his navigational one.
Oh, so?
Well, Block compiled an extensive map of all the coastal areas he had charted. He needed a way to demarcate this specific economic zone, which sat uncomfortably between the established English colony of Virginia to the south and French Canada to the north.
So he had to brand it.
Yeah. So he applied a new name to the map, New Netherland.
Okay, let's unpack this. Block returns to Amsterdam, hands over the map, and says, "Here's New Netherland." And because he charted it, the Dutch government grants him exclusive trading rights.
He basically becomes the very first corporate monopolist of Manhattan.
Right. So the VOC is operating like a 17th century equivalent of a large tech company running an aggressive R&D division. They fund venture capitalists like Hudson and Block, send them into the void, and hope one of them secures a proprietary patent on a new global trade route.
That's a great way to frame it.
But here's my issue with the logic. If the overarching singular goal was just finding a shortcut to the spices of Asia, why bother claiming the land at all? Once Hudson hits shallow water near modern-day Albany and realizes it's not the Northwest Passage, why not just roll up the map, chalk it up as a failed experiment, and move on?
That is the crucial pivot point in a Dutch mindset. What you have to understand is that the political leadership in The Hague recognized the secondary value of what Hudson and Block had found.
The resources.
Yes, it wasn't the Spice Islands, but it was highly resource-rich. So on March 27, 1614, the sovereign body of the Dutch Republic, the States General, issued a highly strategic document. It was titled The General Charter for Those Who Discover Any New Passages, Havens, Countries, or Places.
I love how literal 17th century legal titles are. What was the actual mechanism of this charter, though? How did it change things on the ground?
It democratized the colonial experiment. Previously, only the monopolistic VOC could legally conduct this kind of trade. The States General realized that the Republic didn't have the state funds to develop this vast new territory, so they deliberately moved away from a strict monopoly and opened the market.
Just open it up to everyone.
Yeah, the text of the charter explicitly invited all and every of the inhabitants of the United Netherlands to the aforesaid search.
They crowdsourced the colonization. They put out an open call to any merchant, any sailor, any investor in the Republic. Like, if you want to risk your capital to set up a business in New Netherland, the government gives you permission.
Spot on. It was an open commercial invitation. The charter stated this experiment was laudable, honorable, and serviceable for the prosperity of the United Provinces. They transitioned from funding solitary explorers to actively encouraging a swarm of commercial enterprise by private citizens.
And the timeline of how quickly that legal document translates into physical architecture is striking. These temporary seasonal trading expeditions rapidly solidify into permanent infrastructure. Just 1 year after that open charter, in 1615, the first Dutch settlement in the Americas is constructed.
Fort Nassau.
Right. They build Fort Nassau on Castle Island, situated in the Hudson River near present-day Albany.
Now, we do need to clarify what settlement means in this context. Fort Nassau was not a picturesque agricultural village with white picket fences and families plowing fields.
Definitely not.
It was a fortified warehouse. It functioned exclusively as an outpost for the fur trade. The Dutch merchants engaged directly with the native Lenape and Mohican tribes, trading European manufactured goods, metal kettles, iron axes, glass beads, and firearms for beaver pelts.
And those beaver pelts were incredibly lucrative back in Europe. They were driving a huge fashion industry for waterproof felt hats.
They were the commercial lifeblood of the early colony. Now, Fort Nassau was highly prone to flooding, so it was eventually replaced slightly further north by a more robust structure named Fort Orange.
Still near modern Albany.
Yeah. Both of these outposts, by the way, were named to honor the House of Orange-Nassau, the ruling noble family of the Dutch Republic, which was standard corporate branding of the era.
So the infrastructure is creeping up the river, but the corporate structure back in Amsterdam is also evolving. By 1621, the United Provinces realize they need an entity dedicated specifically to the Atlantic world.
Because the VOC was focused on the Indian Ocean?
Right. So the government charters the Dutch West India Company, or the WIC. The WIC is granted an absolute trading monopoly encompassing the Americas and the western coast of Africa. And they immediately push for official recognition as the founders of a new world province.
Which they achieve in 1623. New Netherland is officially elevated to the status of a province.
And with that provincial status, the WIC aggressively expands its footprint. That same year, 1623, they establish a southern anchor. They construct a second outpost, also named Fort Nassau, but this one is located far to the south on the Delaware River.
Near what is today Gloucester City, New Jersey.
Right. They are creating a network of isolated trade nodes along the major river arteries.
But a network of forts and warehouses is useless without personnel to run them. A corporation needs employees. So in 1624, the first actual colonists arrive in New Netherland, and who the WIC chose to send is, it's really notable.
Not wealthy Dutch citizens?
No, these weren't elite citizens looking for summer homes. The ships primarily carried Walloons.
The demographic composition is vital here.
Yeah. The Walloons were French-speaking Protestants originally from the southern Netherlands, which is roughly modern-day Belgium. They had fled north to the Dutch Republic to escape the brutal religious persecution of the Catholic Spanish Inquisition.
So they were refugees.
They were refugees. The WIC offered them contracts, free passage across the Atlantic in exchange for several years of bound labor to the company. They were essentially indentured corporate employees.
And the sources note they were accompanied by enslaved servants. The WIC drops them at Governor's Island, right in the harbor of New York, and then disperses these Walloon families to hold the far-flung outposts. They send contingents up the river to Fort Orange, south to the Delaware, and out to the mouth of the Connecticut River at a place called Kievitzhoek.
But you cannot run a provincial network without a centralized headquarters. The defining administrative moment arrives in 1626. The director of New Netherland, Peter Minuit, executed his famous transaction, purchasing the island of Manhattan from the local Lenape natives.
Which we need to pause on, because the concept of buying Manhattan is heavily skewed by European legal definitions. The Lenape didn't possess a framework for exclusive permanent land ownership in the way a Dutch lawyer would understand it.
Right, it was a totally different worldview.
They were likely negotiating shared use rights, allowing the Dutch to hunt and camp, while Minuit believed he was acquiring a permanent, exclusive corporate deed.
The cultural misunderstanding was profound. But from the WIC's perspective, they now owned the prime real estate. This transaction authorized the immediate construction of Fort Amsterdam at the southern tip of the island.
Which becomes the anchor.
Yeah, Fort Amsterdam became the commercial, military, and administrative anchor. It grew into the main port and capital city, New Amsterdam. From that highly secure, deep-water harbor, the colony finally began to expand organically.
People moving outside the fort.
Exactly. Former company employees who had fulfilled their contracts began setting up farms in outlying areas, places that retain their Dutch names, like Pavonia, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and across Long Island.
But look at the societal structure of New Amsterdam. It is fundamentally a company town. The governor isn't a politician appointed by a king. He is a director general appointed by a board of shareholders in Amsterdam.
Very different dynamic.
The society is structured entirely around the wayhouses, the harbor logistics, and the fur trade routes. There is no divine mandate here. There is only the balance sheet.
And that underlying corporate structure dictates how they handle border disputes, which become increasingly volatile. Because the Dutch are focused on controlling trade nodes rather than blanketing the map with continuous settlements, Their borders are highly porous.
Hard to defend.
Yeah, they're defined entirely by where they can project military force. Let's look at the northern frontier. By 1633, the WIC completed Fort Crise de Goube, the House of Good Hope, on the Connecticut River near present-day Hartford.
But they run into an unstoppable force, which is English demographics. By 1636, English settlers from Newtown, Massachusetts, just start pouring over the border, settling on the north side of the Little River.
The Dutch just didn't have the sheer human numbers to stop them.
Right. Following diplomatic negotiations that culminated in the Treaty of Hartford, the official border of New Netherland was drastically retracted westward. And by 1653, the English had completely swallowed up the Dutch trading post in Connecticut.
While the northern border was collapsing under demographic pressure, the WIC was actively consolidating in the south. Expansion along the Delaware River beyond the initial Fort Nassau accelerated in the 1650s. The catalyst for this was the Dutch absorption of a rival colony.
The Swedes.
Yeah. In 1638, the Swedish had established a colony at Fort Christina, situated in what is today Wilmington, Delaware.
So the WIC just executes a hostile takeover of the Swedish infrastructure.
Pretty much. They marched in and forced a surrender in 1655. They renamed Fort Christina to Fort Altina. The WIC administration also decided that maintaining numerous tiny, vulnerable outposts was financially inefficient.
Right, closing down the underperforming branches.
Exactly. So they abandoned smaller settlements like the short-lived Fort Bevers Reed and consolidated their southern military and commercial presence into a primary hub at Fort Casimir. It was a classic corporate restructuring to reduce overhead costs while maintaining market share.
Okay, so map this out for me. By the late 1650s, the WIC has a reorganized southern border in Delaware, a thriving deep-water capital in New Amsterdam, and a lucrative fur conduit at Fort Orange. They appear highly established. But then we hit the year 1664.
The turning point.
Yeah. An English naval expedition sails into New Amsterdam harbor, trains its cannons on the fort, and threatens to flatten the city. The Director General, Peter Stuyvesant, the fiercely loyal corporate executive of this entire operation, just surrenders. He signs the Articles of Capitulation without firing a shot. How does the capital of a province spanning multiple modern states just fold like a cheap suit without a protracted siege?
Well, you have to look at the mathematics of defense and the reality of a corporate colony versus a settler colony. The Dutch population across all of New Netherland was roughly 10,000 people.
That's tiny.
The surrounding English colonies in New England and Virginia numbered upwards of 50,000. Stuyvesant stood on the walls of Fort Amsterdam walls that were earthen, crumbling, and practically useless against naval artillery, and realized that a military defense was mathematically suicidal.
The WIC had fundamentally underfunded his military budget. They wanted the profits of the colony, but refused to pay the high costs of a standing army capable of repelling the Royal Navy.
Precisely. Furthermore, the local citizens, the burghers of New Amsterdam, explicitly petitioned Stuyvesant not to fight. Their property, their warehouses, their livelihoods were on that island.
Right, a bombardment would destroy their personal wealth.
Stuyvesant recognized that protecting the assets of the citizens through a negotiated surrender was far more pragmatic than martyring the city for corporate pride.
Cut your losses, negotiate favorable terms to keep your local businesses running under a new flag, and live to trade another day. It is the ultimate pragmatic business decision.
And the capitulation instantly transformed the map. The province was rebranded as New York, honoring the Duke of York. Up the river, the vital fur trading hub of Fort Orange became Fort Albany. The expansive territory sitting between the lower Hudson and the Delaware rivers was carved out, deeded to English proprietors, and established as New Jersey.
But dropping the flag in Manhattan triggered a large geopolitical shockwave. The English seizure of New Netherland was a primary catalyst for the Second Anglo-Dutch War, a naval conflict that burned across the oceans from 1665 to 1667. And the diplomatic resolution of that war is arguably the most vital piece of evidence for understanding the core thesis of our deep dive today. The conflict concluded with the Treaty of Breda.
The Treaty of Breda is the ultimate window into the Dutch mind. During the peace negotiations, the Dutch had the leverage to demand the return of New Netherland. Instead, they explicitly chose to forfeit their claim to New York. They officially traded it away.
And what did they get?
In exchange, they demanded the English formally recognize Dutch control over a colony in South America. Suriname.
Wait, hold on. Even in the 17th century, how could any corporate board justify giving up the Hudson River, the fur trade, and the deepest natural harbor on the eastern seaboard? Didn't anyone at the WIC see the long-term geographic value of Manhattan? Trading New York for Suriname feels like the worst real estate deal in human history.
It feels that way today because we know what New York became,
Yeah.
but you have to view the world through the WIC's ledgers in 1667. The fur trade in North America was highly volatile, dependent on indigenous alliances, and the beaver populations were already being depleted.
It was a fading industry.
Yeah. Furthermore, New Netherland required constant, expensive military defense against the English.
And Suriname offered something far more reliable.
Suriname offered sugar. Sugar in the 17th century was the closest thing to printing money. It was an insatiable global market. The profit margins on a single shipload of processed South American sugar dwarfed the returns on North American timber and furs.
So it's just math.
Just math. The WIC accountants looked at the spreadsheets and concluded that securing a tropical agricultural hub was vastly superior to maintaining a freezing, contested outpost surrounded by hostile English settlers. Commerce dictated the treaty.
The geopolitical tug-of-war in North America didn't vanish instantly, though. Just a few years later, during the Third Anglo-Dutch War from 1673 to 1674, a Dutch fleet actually sailed back into New York Harbor, forced the English to surrender, and briefly reclaimed the territory, renaming the city New Orange.
Briefly being the operative word, the Dutch held it for barely a year before returning it permanently to England via the Treaty of Westminster, once again prioritizing other global concessions over the North American mainland.
And the sources provide this completely absurd, interesting footnote to their North American ambitions involving Acadia up in modern-day Canada.
Oh, right, New Holland.
Yeah. In 1674, a Dutch Navy captain named Jurien Arnauts sailed up the coast and managed to capture 2 isolated forts in the French colony of Acadia. Without consulting anyone, he unilaterally declared it Dutch territory, christened it the new colony of New Holland, appointed a guy named John Rhodes as the administrator, and then promptly sailed away to Curaçao to look for people willing to move there.
It is the definition of a paper colony. Captain Arnauts lacked any logistical support, military backing, or actual settlers. Administrator Rhodes completely lost control of the territory almost immediately.
The French just took it right back.
They simply reasserted their dominance, and Dutch sovereignty in Acadia existed exclusively on legal parchment. The Netherlands maintained the meaningless claim for a few years before formally abandoning it during the treaties of Nijmegen.
Just giving up on it.
Yeah, the Acadian incident highlights a recurring truth. Claiming a territory with the flag is cheap and easy. Holding that territory against rival empires requires a constant, large expenditure of resources that the WIC's corporate model consistently refused to authorize if the immediate financial return was not obvious.
Since the WIC's accountants so clearly valued their southern holdings enough to trade away the entirety of the North American eastern seaboard in the Treaty of Breda, we need to shift our map southward. We need to examine what was happening in those tropical waters that justified losing Manhattan. This brings us to a phase of expansion we can call the Caribbean Carousel.
The Dutch strategy in the Caribbean was incredibly fast, highly aggressive, and relentlessly strategic. They did not arrive looking for large land masses to settle thousands of European farmers. They began picking off specific, tactically valuable islands.
Like stepping stones.
Yeah. They established an initial presence on Tobago as early as 1628. By 1631, they had set up rudimentary operations on Sint Maarten and Tortuga, the famous pirate haven now known as El Tortue.
And from there, the acquisition rate accelerates dramatically. They seize Bonaire and Curaçao in 1634, St. Eustatius falls in 1636, Aruba in 1637, and the tiny, steep island of Saba in 1640. They are rapidly assembling a necklace of islands across the sea.
But you have to analyze the fundamental purpose of these specific islands. Why Aruba and Curaçao? They are incredibly arid. You cannot grow vast plantations of sugar there.
Right, they're basically deserts.
But what Curaçao does have is the Shawnigat, one of the most perfect, naturally protected deepwater harbors in the entire Caribbean basin.
So if they aren't farming, what is the economic engine?
Logistics and smuggling. The Spanish Empire claimed a strict monopoly over trade in the Americas, heavily taxing or outright banning foreign goods. The Dutch used islands like Curaçao and St. Eustatius as heavily fortified distribution centers.
Smuggling hubs.
Yes. They would stockpile European-manufactured goods, weapons, and tragically enslaved African people, and then smuggle them into the resource-rich Spanish colonies on the mainland. Furthermore, islands like Bonaire and Saint Martin possess large natural salt pans.
And salt was a big deal.
Salt was critically required back in Europe for preserving the herring catch, which was a pillar of the Dutch domestic economy.
This strategic, logistical mindset explains the extreme fluidity of the borders in the Caribbean. Because they are treating the islands as interchangeable warehouses rather than sacred homelands, they adapt instantly to military pressure. Look at St. Martin. The Dutch establish a presence, then briefly build a fort on nearby Anguilla. Then a Spanish fleet arrives and violently ejects them from St. Martin.
Does the WIC despair?
No, they just pivot. They pour their resources into developing Curaçao and St. Eustatius and wait. Decades later, in 1648, they return and retake half of St. Martin. From that point onward, they willingly share the small island with the French.
And the internal border on St. Martin was modified and renegotiated constantly over the centuries. Legend says the border was originally decided by a walking contest between a Frenchman and a Dutchman, but historically it was a constant diplomatic adjustment.
Just redrawing the map over and over.
The lines were not permanently legally fixed until 1816. The concept of definitive, unyielding territorial boundaries was entirely alien to their operating procedure. To further illustrate this, the Dutch government legally claimed several offshore islands, FFs, the Ags Archipelago, Los Roques, and La Orquilla, which are unequivocally Venezuelan today, and obstinately considered them part of the Dutch West Indies deep into the 19th century.
If St. Martin represents the pragmatic fluidity of corporate borders, the island of Tobago represents the sheer, unadulterated brutality of this mercantile competition. The history of Tobago in the 17th century is a nightmare of cyclical violence. Between 1628 and 1677, the Dutch made relentless attempts to colonize the island, which they designated New Walcheren.
Tobago is a dark case study in imperial attrition. Let's trace the logistics of this nightmare. In 1628, the Dutch expend enormous capital outfitting ships, transporting men, timber, and cannons across the Atlantic, and constructing Fort Vlissingen.
A huge initial investment.
9 years later, by 1637, a Spanish force arrives, breaches the walls, and massacres the settlement.
So the WIC loses the entire investment. The men, the materials, the time.
Completely erased. But the WIC regroups. In 1654, they try again, injecting fresh capital to build Forts Lamsonsburg, Beveren, and Bella Vista. A decade later, British arrive and conquer those forts. Shortly after that, by 1666, a French fleet arrives and burns the conquered forts to the ground.
This is madness. But the Dutch just keep coming back to the ashes. In 1667, they return, clear the ruins, and build a new settlement named New Vlissingen. 5 years later, in 1672, the British arrive and destroy it again. So in 1676, the WIC funds another expedition, returning to build Forts Torretians. And exactly 1 year later, in 1677, the French obliterated.
We see the exact same devastating pattern in the Virgin Islands. The Dutch establish a base on St. Croix in 1625. The British set up camp on the same island that very year. French Protestants arrive seeking refuge and join the Dutch side.
A very crowded island.
Very. The resulting localized warfare with the British faction becomes so costly that the Dutch simply abandon their settlement before 1650. They try establishing a presence on Tortola before 1640, eventually expanding operations to Anegada, St. Thomas, and Virgin Gorda. But the British military machine grinds them down, taking Tortola in 1672 and sweeping up Anegada and Virgin Gorda by 1680.
Here is where it gets really interesting and where I have to question the entire corporate model. I look at this Caribbean strategy, and it resembles a high-stakes, incredibly bloody game of musical chairs. But why do the Dutch keep pouring immense capital, ships, and human lives into an island like Tobago? Why reconstruct a fort knowing full well it has been burned to the ground 4 separate times in 50 years? At some point, doesn't the board of directors look at the ledger and realize the attrition rate far outweighs any conceivable economic upside?
Well, you are applying modern, stable economic logic to a 17th century mercantilist war economy. To understand the WIC's stubbornness, you have to realize that dominating the Caribbean supply chains was a zero-sum game against the French, the British, and the Spanish.
Right, if you don't hold it, they do.
Exactly. The potential profits from a successful sugar harvest, combined with the strategic necessity of denying a naval base to a rival empire, justified horrifying risks. If holding Tobago for 5 years allowed you to secure the trade routes that moved enslaved labor to your other colonies and moved processed sugar back to Amsterdam, the eventual loss of the fort was just calculated as the cost of doing business.
The cost of maintaining the monopoly. If you're a stockholder back in Amsterdam, you aren't mourning the loss of the physical fort on Tobago. You're just calculating whether the sugar that made it out before the French arrived covered your initial investment. But this raises an incredibly important question regarding the long-term impact of this philosophy. If you treat human beings and islands as temporary corporate hubs, how does that fundamentally shape the modern reality of these societies?
The cultural and political ramifications are profound and enduring. Unlike New York, many of these Caribbean holdings remained official overseas territories of the Netherlands for centuries. They were not granted self-rule until the mid-20th century, when they were reorganized in 1954 as the Netherlands Antilles.
But the legacy of how they were built remained.
Yeah, the rigid, race-based social hierarchies established by the WIC during the colonial era, where a tiny European elite controlled the wealth generated by an African-descended majority, eventually reached a breaking point.
The sources specifically highlight the events in Curaçao in 1969. The island had developed a large oil refining industry, primarily run by Shell, which brought wealth, but that wealth was severely stratified. A labor strike by refinery workers escalated rapidly into heavy civil unrest and rioting in the capital, Willemstad.
It was a very serious situation.
The situation deteriorated so severely that the local government requested military intervention, and Dutch Marines had to be flown across the Atlantic to physically secure the island.
The 1969 uprising was a monumental watershed moment in the island's history. While the Marines restored physical order, the political order was permanently shattered. The uprising effectively ended the centuries-long political and administrative dominance of the white, European-descended minority.
It changed everything.
It catalyzed a large social awakening, leading directly to the ascendance of an Afro-Curaçaoan political elite. To illustrate the completeness of this shift, nearly every single governor, prime minister, and cabinet minister in Curaçao since the early 1970s has been of African descent.
The political architecture of the region continued to evolve dramatically from there, constantly adjusting the relationship with the European mainland. In 1986, Aruba voted to gain its own autonomy, technically separating from the administrative umbrella of the Netherlands Antilles. And then quite recently, on October 10, 2010, the entire entity of the Netherlands Antilles was officially and legally dissolved.
The restructuring was comprehensive. The islands of Curaçao and Sint Maarten achieved the status of constituent countries within the broader Kingdom of the Netherlands, giving them a status equal to Aruba. Meanwhile, the smaller islands, Bonaire, Saba, and St. Eustatius, chose a different path.
They integrated more closely.
Yes, they became special municipalities, integrating much more closely with the administrative and tax systems of the Netherlands itself. It is a remarkable, ongoing evolution. From 17th century corporate smuggling hubs entirely dependent on the WIC, they have transformed into modern, self-governing constituent countries and specialized municipalities. The administrative flexibility of the modern Dutch state echoes the pragmatic adaptability of the early corporate empire.
But this purely corporate approach, where everything is just a line item on a ledger and islands are treated as disposable warehouses, starts to show huge systemic cracks when you look at how they handled vast contiguous physical landmasses. You cannot just manage a continent the way you manage a trade route. And this fundamental flaw becomes painfully obvious when we shift our focus to the mainland of South America. This brings us to the Dutch West India Company's most ambitious and ultimately disastrous undertaking, the Brazilian experiment.
Prior to 1630, the Portuguese possessed a highly lucrative monopoly on the vast sugar plantations of northeastern Brazil. The WIC recognized that smuggling sugar through the Caribbean was profitable, but owning the source of production outright would be revolutionary.
Cutting out the middleman entirely.
Yeah. So, starting in 1630, the Dutch Republic launched a huge military invasion. They successfully captured a large swath of northeastern Brazil from the Portuguese, establishing their central headquarters in the coastal city of Recife.
This is a major escalation from anything we've discussed so far. They aren't building a wooden fort to trade metal kettles for beaver pelts. They are attempting to conquer, occupy, and manage a huge agricultural economy, utilizing thousands of enslaved laborers.
Exactly. And the individual chosen to administer this newly conquered territory, Governor Johan Moritz of Nassau-Siegen, approached the task with a philosophy entirely unique in the history of the WIC. Moritz envisioned Dutch Brazil, which they called New Holland, not just as a site of extraction, but as a beacon of European civilization in the tropics.
He had grand ideas.
When he arrived in Recife, he did not just bring heavily armed mercenary soldiers and corporate accountants.
The sources are really interesting here. He essentially imports an entire university faculty. He brings painters, like Franz Post and Albert Eckhout, to document the indigenous populations and the landscape. He brings an astronomer to build the first observatory in the Americas. He brings a physician, Willem Piso, to study tropical medicine.
Moritz was actively attempting to stimulate migration and investment by framing the colony as a center of scientific inquiry and high culture. Furthermore, the colony became renowned for exporting a specific Dutch tradition to the New World: religious tolerance. The WIC allowed significant freedom of religion.
Which, again, we have to view through the lens of corporate pragmatism. Was this tolerance born of moral enlightenment or business necessity?
Pure business necessity. The mechanics of the sugar industry required extensive capital and highly specialized knowledge. A significant portion of the successful sugar mill owners in the region were Sephardic Jews who had originally fled the Inquisition.
So if they persecuted them, the economy would crash.
Right. The WIC realized that if they instituted religious persecution, these vital economic engines would leave, and the sugar profits would collapse. Tolerance was a strategy to ensure the mills kept grinding.
So Johann Moritz is desperately trying to build this enlightened utopian cultural center, complete with scientists mapping the stars and artists painting the jungle. But he is trying to build it directly on top of a hostile, violent corporate acquisition. He's trying to force his civilization onto a war zone.
And the underlying reality of that war zone eventually crushed the utopian vision. The Portuguese planters who remained in the territory deeply resented the Dutch occupation. They initiated a grueling, relentless guerrilla insurgency, bleeding the WIC's military resources dry through ambushes and sabotage.
It was unsustainable.
Very. The decisive military turning point arrived in 1649 at the Second Battle of Guarapes. The Portuguese insurgent forces won a crushing victory over the professional Dutch military.
That defeat shattered the illusion of control. The Dutch hold on the territory crumbled rapidly over the next few years. Finally, on January 26, 1654, the Dutch Republic formally capitulated. They signed a treaty surrendering control of the entirety of the northeastern Brazilian colony back to the Portuguese crown. The grand experiment was over.
Or so it seemed on the ground in South America. However, the geopolitics back in Europe severely complicated the narrative. Following the conclusion of the First Anglo-Dutch War in May 1654, the Dutch Republic found itself with a huge, mobilized naval fleet and nothing to do with it.
A dangerous combination.
Feeling empowered, the Dutch government sent an ultimatum to Lisbon. They demanded the immediate return of New Holland to Dutch sovereignty. If the Portuguese refused, the Dutch threatened to blockade the Portuguese coast and launch a major naval invasion to reoccupy Brazil.
And the Portuguese are trapped. They are already heavily engaged in an existential war of independence against the Spanish Empire on their eastern border. They absolutely cannot afford to fight the mighty Dutch navy simultaneously. So, astonishingly, the Portuguese caved. They agreed to the Dutch demands. The Dutch win the diplomatic standoff and legally secure the return of the colony.
They fought for it, they lost it, they threatened a global war to get it back, and they won. But what happens next is the ultimate, undeniable expression of the Dutch colonial philosophy. On August 6, 1661, the political leader of the Dutch Republic, Johan de Witt, finalized the Treaty of The Hague. Through the mechanisms of this treaty, de Witt took the colony they had just threatened war to regain, and he sold it back to Portugal.
Let me make sure I understand the sequence of events. They invest millions to conquer it. Johan Moritz tries to build a scientific utopia. The Portuguese slaughter them at Guarapes. The WIC threatens a naval blockade to force Portugal to return the territory. Portugal says, fine, take it. And then Johan de Witt immediately turns around and sells the entire continent-sized colony back to Portugal for 8 million guilders. How is this anything other than a colossal admission of failure? Was Moritz's cultural experiment just a laughable disaster? Or is this the coldest, hardest corporate accounting imaginable?
It is the apex of pragmatic, cold-blooded accounting. You have to understand Johan de Witt's core geopolitical philosophy. Global commerce was fundamentally more valuable and vastly cheaper to maintain than territorial sovereignty.
The overhead was just too high.
Right. De Witt analyzed the situation in Brazil and realized it was a sunk cost trap. Yes, they legally owned it again, but maintaining control over a large South American landmass surrounded by a hostile, entrenched Portuguese population that had already proven capable of defeating the Dutch army at Guarapes would require maintaining a permanent, incredibly expensive standing army.
The military overhead would completely consume the sugar profits.
Precisely. It would be a relentless drain on the Republic's treasury. So, trading that volatile, hostile territory for immediate financial compensation, 8 million guilders, and securing highly favorable, long-term commercial trading rights in Portuguese ports worldwide fit the Dutch economic model perfectly.
It makes sense when you put it like that.
It immediately stabilized their balance sheets and allowed them to focus capital on more defensible, profitable hubs. They traded the prestige of empire for cold, hard cash.
That purely pragmatic, ledger-driven approach defined their 17th century interaction with the Brazilian mainland. But history has a way of rhyming. The sources reveal an interesting echo that brings the Dutch back to the Brazilian interior centuries later, entirely independent of any corporate army. Following the absolute devastation of Europe during the World War II, the Dutch economy was in ruins. The government actively recognized that they lacked the agricultural land to feed their population and began heavily stimulating emigration to nations like Australia, Canada, and Brazil.
Brazil was a uniquely attractive destination in the immediate post-war period. Unlike many other nations, the Brazilian government explicitly permitted and encouraged the arrival of large groups of Catholic immigrants. A domestic Dutch organization, the Catholic Dutch Farmers and Market Gardeners Union, recognized this opportunity and directly coordinated a large-scale immigration process in full compliance with the Brazilian authorities.
This isn't a military conquest. This is a desperate search for arable land. A huge group of roughly 5,000 rural migrants, primarily from the southern Dutch province of North Brabant, boarded ships and crossed the Atlantic. They arrived in the Brazilian state of São Paulo and established their initial agricultural colony on an old farm called Fazenda Ribeirão.
Which they renamed.
Yeah, they named their new settlement Holambra, a portmanteau of Holland, America, and Brazil. Holambra I was officially founded on July 14, 1948.
And the contrast between the WIC's 17th century disaster and this 20th century migration is profound. The 17th century attempt, funded by corporate capital and enforced by mercenaries, collapsed into warfare and was sold. But this migration of destitute farmers utilizing a system of intense agricultural cooperatives proved incredibly enduring.
They actually made it work.
They adapted to the climate, shifted their crops, and the community thrived. In 1991, 98% of the local population voted in favor of gaining political autonomy for the municipality. By January 1993, Holambra was officially elevated to city status.
And today, Holambra is a major economic success story. It is renowned across South America for its vast industrial-scale production of flowers and ornamental plants. It has leaned into its heritage, drawing thousands of tourists annually for its large flower festival, Expo Flora. In April 1998, the Brazilian government even granted it the official status of Estancia Turística, a tourist resort.
Quite a turnaround.
Yeah, and the overwhelming success of the Holambra cooperative model catalyzed further immigration waves, creating an entire network of cities scattered across southern Brazil, where the majority of the population traces their descent directly back to these Dutch immigrants. Thriving agricultural hubs like Castrolanda, Carambeí, Nomitoque, Whitmarsum, Arapoti, and Campos de Holambra.
It is a profound historical irony. The militarized, WIC-funded attempt to force Dutch civilization onto Brazil failed spectacularly. But a peaceful, desperate migration of farmers seeking a new life successfully and permanently embedded Dutch culture and agriculture deep into the Brazilian soil.
Having explored the complex failure of the WIC's territorial ambitions in Brazil, we must pivot our attention to the other regions of the South American continent. We need to examine the zones where the Dutch either successfully maintained a brutal colonial grip for centuries, or where they launched expeditions so speculative and bizarre they defy conventional logic. Let's start with the long-term holdings, the Guianas and Suriname.
The Dutch established a foothold on the northern coast of South America, the area known as the Guianas, remarkably early. In 1616, while the VOC was still mapping the Hudson River, the WIC was already constructing a fortified trading post on the Essequibo River in South America.
So they were moving fast.
Very fast. Initially, their operations mirrored the North American model, trading European goods with the indigenous populations. However, the tropical climate dictated a rapid and devastating shift in the economic model. They quickly transitioned away from simple trade and established vast, brutally intensive sugar plantations.
And to operate those plantations, they required a large, expendable workforce, which leads directly to the importation of thousands of enslaved African people.
Yes, the plantation economy of the Guianas was entirely dependent on the transatlantic slave trade. But geographically, this coastline was highly vulnerable and heavily contested. While the Dutch maintained control of the major river systems, English colonists began establishing their own plantations just west of the Suriname River.
Setting up a collision.
Exactly. The resulting friction between the Dutch and English settlers mirrored the conflicts we discussed in the Caribbean and North America. The territory comprising the colonies of Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice changed hands violently and repeatedly, depending on which nation was currently winning the latest European naval war. Ultimately, by 1796, the British military secured dominant control of the region. The geopolitical reality was formalized in 1814 when the Netherlands officially and permanently ceded Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice to the British Crown.
But the colony of Suriname, sitting just next door, followed a completely different, inverted trajectory. Suriname was originally established in the 1650s by the British, specifically by Lord Francis Willoughby, the governor of Barbados. He brought English planters and enslaved labor to carve sugar estates out of the jungle. However, during the intense naval combat of the Second Anglo-Dutch War, a highly capable Dutch naval commander named Abraham Creenson sailed a fleet up the Suriname River and successfully captured the entire colony from the British.
And this circles us back directly to the Treaty of Breda. As we established earlier, on July 31, 1667, the Dutch diplomatic corps officially codified Crooinson's conquest. They formalized their control over the highly profitable sugar infrastructure of Suriname by permanently relinquishing their claim to the fur trading outpost of New York.
Trading New York for Suriname.
Yes. The Dutch state maintained control for a few years, but in 1683, true to form, they sold the administrative rights to the colony directly to the Dutch West India Company. From that moment forward, Suriname operated as a pure corporate extraction zone, its economy fueled entirely by the horrifying machinery of African slavery.
The British did briefly reoccupy Suriname decades later during the global chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, holding it from 1799 until 1816, but it was ultimately returned to Dutch sovereignty. But what I find so compelling and disturbing is how the demographic evolution of Suriname serves as a stark representation of how colonial labor policies actively rewrote the genetic makeup of the globe. In 1863, centuries after establishing the system, the Netherlands finally abolished slavery in their colonies. But they instituted a mandatory 10-year transition period where the formerly enslaved people were forced to continue working the plantations for minimal wages.
The WIC and the plantation owners knew that once that 10-year period expired in 1873, the African-descended workforce would leave the brutal conditions of the sugar fields en masse. To prevent a total collapse of the agricultural economy, the colonial administrators required a large new source of cheap bound labor.
So they looked elsewhere in their empire.
Yes, they utilized the infrastructure of the global empire. They began systematically importing thousands of indentured contract workers from the British Raj in India, and crucially from the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia.
Look at the sheer scale of the logistics involved there. Suriname represents a microscopic view of how global colonial labor networks functioned. You have a European colonial power forcibly pulling human demographics from three entirely different continents, Africa, India, and Indonesia, transporting them across oceans, and depositing them into a South American jungle, entirely to sustain the profit margins of a single agricultural export.
The resulting demographic reality of modern Suriname is incredibly complex and diverse, a direct result of those specific labor importations. The political evolution of the colony followed a trajectory similar to the Caribbean islands we discussed. Internal self-governance, allowing local control over domestic affairs, was granted in 1954. Full sovereign independence from the Kingdom of the Netherlands was finally achieved in 1975.
But that transition wasn't entirely smooth.
No, the looming prospect of independence terrified a large segment of the population. The fear of impending political instability, racial tension between the various imported demographic groups, and severe economic decline sparked a major wave of preemptive migration. Thousands of Surinamese citizens utilized their Dutch passports to migrate directly to the Netherlands prior to independence.
The sources indicate that the legacy of that migration is highly visible today. The Surinamese community residing within the Netherlands is substantial. It numbers approximately 350,000 people, which is nearly equivalent to half of the entire current population of Suriname itself. The brutal mechanics of the colonial plantation economy ultimately created a permanent, living demographic bridge connecting South America directly to the European mainland.
While Suriname represents centuries of entrenched, highly organized agricultural colonization, the final area we need to examine, the Dutch activities on the Pacific coast of South America, showcases their more opportunistic, highly speculative, and almost improvisational strategies. We must examine the Chilean expeditions.
The timeline of Dutch involvement in Chile is erratic to the point of absurdity. It begins in the year 1600. A Dutch maritime raider, essentially a state-sanctioned pirate named Sebastian de Cordes, sailed his heavily armed vessels down the coast and successfully captured the major Chilean port city of Valdivia. But he had no logistical support or intention of staying. He occupied the city for a few months, plundered whatever he could carry, and abandoned it. It was a smash-and-grab raid, not a colonization attempt.
Decades later, however, the corporate behemoths decided to get involved. In 1642, the VOC and the WIC executed a rare joint venture. They combined their capital and dispatched a heavily armed fleet down the Pacific coast toward Chile. Their objective was highly specific and entirely speculative. They wanted to conquer Valdivia permanently.
Wait, why Valdivia?
Because they operated on the widely circulated, though entirely unverified, rumor that the region contained incredibly lucrative gold mines. The expedition was commanded by a seasoned Dutch admiral, Hendrik Brouwer.
Let me stop you there. You're telling me that these highly calculating, ledger-obsessed corporate boards authorized the enormous expense of a naval fleet, sailing it halfway around the globe, entirely based on a rumor of gold. Who approves that level of speculative risk?
Well, the promise of precious metals makes even the most rational accountants irrational. If Valdivia possessed gold veins equivalent to what the Spanish had found in Peru, the WIC and VOC could theoretically bankrupt the Spanish Empire while enriching themselves beyond measure. It was a high-risk, world-altering reward scenario.
But the reality of the expedition was a disaster. Admiral Brouwer never even saw Valdivia. He fell ill and died in 1643 while the fleet was still navigating the complex waters of the Keeler Archipelago. Command fell to his lieutenant, a man named Elias Herkmans. Herkmans pushed the fleet forward, arrived at Valdivia, and succeeded in capturing the city, or rather capturing the abandoned ruins of the city as the local population had largely fled.
A somewhat hollow victory.
Very. Herkmans immediately ordered his men to refortify the crumbling walls and, in a burst of corporate pride, officially christened the new outpost Brouwershaven.
But the pride evaporated almost instantly. As Herkman's men pushed into the interior to locate the promised wealth, the reality of the situation crushed them. They scoured the region and found absolutely no gold. What they did find was a highly organized, deeply hostile indigenous Mapuche population that constantly harassed their patrols.
So they're bleeding money and finding nothing.
Exactly. Facing severe supply shortages, a mutinous crew, and the utter absence of the mineral wealth required to offset the vast daily cost of the expedition, the Dutch administrators recognized the failure. They packed up their surviving men and abandoned the outpost entirely. Brouwershaven simply ceased to exist, and the territory was quietly reincorporated into the Spanish Empire.
So in the 17th century, the Dutch arrive in Chile as heavily armed pirates, and later as heavily armed corporate gold hunters, both times failing to leave a permanent mark. But centuries later, the dynamic shifts completely. We see waves of Dutch migration to Chile that are totally distinct from the corporate era. Between 1895 and 1897, a small group of roughly a dozen Dutch families arrived and settled in the Chiloé region, specifically in areas with names like Macaiko, Huilinco, and Chacao.
This wasn't a corporate venture.
No, this was a deliberate program organized by the Chilean government's General Inspector of Colonization and Immigration to populate the southern regions.
We actually have highly specific, granular records of these individuals, proving the organized nature of the migration. For example, the sources note a man named Hageman Egbert, who arrived with his entire family on April 14, 1896, establishing a homestead in Rio Gato near Portamont. Colonization of the Villarica region.
But the most notable and substantial wave of migration to Chile occurred shortly after that, driven by a brutal geopolitical conflict on another continent entirely. Following the conclusion of the Boer War, the British Empire violently annexed the Boer republics in South Africa, utilizing scorched earth tactics that left the region devastated. A large group of Dutch Bears farmers of Dutch descent who had lived in Africa for generations refused to live under British rule and decided to emigrate en masse.
Seeking a fresh start.
Yeah. Utilizing diplomatic channels, they sought a new homeland, and the Chilean government welcomed them. On May 4, 1903, a highly organized group of over 200 Dutch emigrants boarded a steamship named the Oropesa in La Rochelle, France, and sailed for South America.
The demographic breakdown of that specific voyage is meticulously documented, illustrating how regionalized the migration was. 35% of the passengers hailed from the provinces of North Holland and South Holland, 13% originated from North Brabant, and 9% each came from Zeeland and Gelderland.
It's credible that we have those numbers.
It really is. After crossing the ocean, they traveled by train, arriving on June 5 at their final destination, the Chilean city of Petrufquén, near the rural hamlet of Donguil.
Think about the resilience required to abandon a burned farm in South Africa, cross the Atlantic via a French port, and step off a train in rural Chile to start completely over. And they weren't the last. Other groups quickly followed on ships bearing names like the Aravi and the Arissa. These settlers pooled their resources and established a large agricultural network in Donguil, which they fiercely christened the New Transvaal colony, directly honoring the republic they had lost in Africa.
Keeping the memory alive.
Over 500 Boer families eventually established themselves in the region, with the final documented groups arriving between February 7, 1907 and February 18, 1909.
The enduring legacy of those desperate agricultural migrations is highly visible in the demographics of modern Chile. Current estimates indicate that there are approximately 50,000 descendants of these Dutch immigrants living in the country today. They are primarily concentrated in the southern agricultural zones they originally tamed, areas like Maleco, Gorbea, Petrufquén, Faja Maisan, and the regions surrounding Temuco and Osorno.
When you lay out this entire timeline regarding Chile, the sheer whiplash is dizzying. We have state-sanctioned pirates sacking cities, gold-seeking admirals building doomed forts, and centuries later, displaced farmers fleeing British artillery in South Africa, seeking refuge in the shadow of the Andes. When we synthesize all of this, from the fur traders of Manhattan to the sugar lords of Suriname to the Boers of Chile, it feels like the Dutch relationship with the Americas was never governed by a single, unified royal master plan. It was a series of chaotic, highly distinct, brutally pragmatic reactions to global events. How does grasping this fundamentally reframe our modern understanding of the term colonization itself?
It forces us to completely decouple the concept of colonization from the idea of permanent territorial sovereignty and nationalistic pride. Dutch colonization, driven primarily by the WIC and VOC, was uniquely, sometimes horrifically, adaptable. Their goal was never about painting the global map one solid color.
It was about the bottom line.
It was entirely about exploiting localized, highly specific economic opportunities. If the spreadsheet showed that the best return on investment was trading metal axes for beaver furs with the Lenape in New York, they built a fort. If the opportunity lay in smuggling manufactured goods and disrupting Spanish supply lines in the Caribbean, they violently claimed a deep-water harbor.
Like we saw with Curacao.
Right. If the math demanded trading a colossal, potentially empire-building North American territory for a reliably profitable sugar colony in Suriname, they eagerly signed a treaty. And if geopolitical chaos resulted in resettling displaced Boers in the Chilean countryside centuries later, the government facilitated the logistics. The unifying thread connecting all these disparate events across centuries is a cold, calculated pragmatism, entirely devoid of the royal prestige that drove their European rivals.
We have covered a vast, complex geography today. We have traced the flow of capital from the Amsterdam Stock Exchange to the crumbling walls of New Amsterdam on the Hudson River, down through the violently shifting cyclical borders of St. Martin and Tobago, across the bloody sugar fields of Recife, and finally to the ruins of Brouwershaven on the Pacific coast.
As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with a completely different angle on the history we just discussed. We have focused intensely on the WIC and the VOC as agents of colonization, but I want you to view them through a modern lens. Today, we view large multinational corporations, the tech giants, the global logistics firms, as incredibly powerful entities that shape our daily lives, influence politicians, and cross borders effortlessly. But think about what would happen if those modern corporations possessed their own private navies.
What if a major tech company had the legal authority to declare war, bombard a city, or unilaterally trade a sovereign nation for a better supply chain route?
Precisely. Because when you look at the actions of the Dutch West India Company and the Dutch East India Company in the Americas, you are not merely looking at a quirky chapter in the history of European colonization. You're looking directly at the historical blueprint, the absolute birthplace of the modern megacorporation. They proved that private capital, pooled by shareholders and managed by a boardroom, could project power across oceans, topple governments, and literally buy and sell continents. So as you reflect on the legacy of the Dutch in the Americas, it begs an interesting, perhaps unsettling question. Are we merely observing a historical anomaly from the 17th century? Or are we slowly moving back toward a global structure where multinational corporations hold far more tangible physical power than the nations that chartered them?
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.